Matt O'Neill, thanks so much for coming on to Evolution Soup, all the way from Arizona, USA. You are an assistant professor at Midwestern University, specializing in human evolution and the biomechanics of human walking and why our style of locomotion is so unique. So, how are you doing, Matt? I know that the pandemic has thrown a wrench into a lot of scientific work during 2020 and 2021, but hopefully things are getting back on track these days, would you say?
Yeah, good to see you, Mark. Yeah, I would say things are getting back on track. It sounds about right to me. Fortunately, a lot of the work that I do is sort of computational and computer-based. So, during the pandemic, I've been able to kind of continue making steady progress on the work that we started before the pandemic. But it certainly slowed things down just for all of the sort of extraneous issues that arise from that. But we're sort of getting back on track. We have some new personnel working in the lab. And so kind of this fall, we're hoping to make some good forward progress on some long-standing projects on human locomotion and chimpanzee locomotion and some of the other work that we're doing.
Well, it was only a few months ago that I interviewed paleoanthropologist Jeremy Da Silva on the subject of human bipedality and what might have caused our human ancestors to walk upright. We'll be going into our own conclusions about that topic, as well as looking into the biomechanics of upright walking, focusing on our own human lineage. But before we stride down that path, let's just hear a little bit about your background. Now, Matt, were you always interested in science, and in particular, the reasons behind human locomotion?
I would say I'd probably go back to high school. And in high school, I was always interested in history. I was interested in biology. And I have a sort of distinct memory of being really interested in doing research projects. And, in that sort of high school context are typically reviews that we would do of different topics. It could be geography. It could be, a Civil War battle. It could be some issue in biology. But I kind of had those interests together. But as a high school student, really didn't have much exposure to evolutionary biology and really very little to anthropology. But kind of in my, I think, junior year of high school or so, I got the opportunity to go on an archaeological dig one summer. And that was great for a whole host of reasons. I grew up in the sort of Midwest of the United States, and there were some excavations going on at a archaeological site that was not too far from my house. And I was able to do that. And as part of that project, sort of participating in the dig and, participating in kind of the analysis of the material that was coming out of that dig, I got a much sort of better exposure to kind of what real world archaeology is, but also what that archaeology exists as sort of a subfield within anthropology. And so I became kind of cognizant of anthropology as a discipline that was out there, even though I really didn't have any exposure to it as a high school student. So when I got to college, I was able to take courses in all these different topics that were of interest to me. And particularly kind of later in college, I took a couple of courses that were really, I think, kind of influential. One was an evolutionary biology course that I was able to take from a really great evolutionary biologist. And the other was a couple of courses that I was taking within the anthropology department on kind of human evolution. And the evolutionary piece really interested me. And I kind of had this distinct memory of a course that I took, and the professor sort of walking the class through this idea of how or why people think that Neanderthals were this sort of cold adapted population, and looking at correlations between climate and skeletal morphology, and then applying those correlations to the fossil record. And that process really interested me. And so I took kind of a few more courses in that. And then by the time I had was ready to kind of graduate and thinking about what I wanted to do next, I started talking to some of the professors in the anthropology department that I had been in and getting some suggestions on, well, I'm interested in this stuff, and I'm interested in graduate school. Do you have some recommendations as to where I might go to sort of pursue this work? And I got kind of a short list of recommendations, and I applied to some graduate programs, and I ended up going to work with a colleague of one of my undergraduate professors and working with him. And his expertise was really in relating bone morphology, the size and shape of bones, particularly of the distribution of bone within kind of what's called the diaphysis, the sort of long portion of like the femur or the tibia. And that sort of work exposed me to kind of the area of biomechanics, and I got interested in that. And I sort of moved kind of a little more broadly past just looking at skeletal biology to getting interested in issues of physiology and musculoskeletal function. And so that was really all part of my PhD experience, was getting involved in that work and getting interested in how we take data from living animals and then apply them to the fossil record in order to draw inferences about what these fossil hominins were capable of doing. After that, I was able to go and work with a group of faculty that were real experts in applying sort of lab-based experimental biology to questions of evolution. And so, I had a lot of these experiences throughout my graduate career that really got me interested in how we go about figuring out what fossil taxa were capable of doing. Now, sort of how that got me into anatomy is it sort of just turned out that the people that I was most interested in working with all ended up being professors in anatomy departments. And so I, along the way, got a lot of experience teaching anatomy and being involved in anatomy courses from graduate school up through my postdoc experience. And so when I went out and was looking for a faculty position, I ended up teaching and getting excited about and doing a lot of work in anatomy departments. And so that's how I've kind of come to my current position, which involves teaching anatomy to medical students.
Matt, evolution tells us that the human lineage started in Africa and that we share a common ancestor, chimpanzees. Chimps, as we know, are knuckle walkers, walking on all fours, but occasionally will walk upright, same as many other apes. So what do we know about that enigmatic last common ancestor? If we could peek into the past, what might it have looked like?
Well, that's a great question, and it's a question that a lot of researchers have gotten interested in over the past 15 to 20 years. And part of the sort of resurgence of interest in this is due to the fact that we're starting to get fossil material from really the early part of human evolution, the first kind of few million years of the hominin lineage. So kind of the first thing to think about when we're thinking about the last common ancestor is sort of, well, when did it live? And the timing on that, it really comes a lot from the genetic data. And right now we have humans and we have chimpanzees, right? But about 8 million years ago, we didn't really have chimps or humans. We had this other lineage that was ultimately going to evolve and give rise to a lineage of chimps and a lineage of humans that we know today. And so the fact that humans and chimpanzees are so closely related can be used to sort of estimate when that divergence would have taken place. And so that divergence, we think, was probably in the 6 to 8 million year range. Right. So that gives us kind of a timeline, an initial sort of timeline to work with. The next thing we can do is we can kind of look at the fossil record. And, as far as human evolution goes, we have a really extensive hominin fossil record. I mean, paleontologists will always tell you that we need more fossils, and that's always true. But compared to a lot of other things, we have a lot of data to work with for the human lineage. And so we have fossils that we think might be on the human lineage going all the way back to about 7 million years. And so we can kind of calibrate that genetic data against the fossil record. Interestingly, on the chimpanzee side, you may be wondering, well, what do we have for chimpanzees? And the answer is not much.
Nope.
There is very little fossil record for chimpanzees. And so while we can get sort of some insight into what the earliest humans look like, we really don't have much insight into what the earliest chimpanzees look like. And so one of the questions is, well, you know, if we know about when this lineage existed, that this last common ancestor that gave rise to humans and chimps existed, you know, what did it look like? And so there are kind of a couple of ideas about this. One is sort of a long-standing idea, and it has to do with our sort of closely related African ape relatives, chimpanzees and gorillas. And chimpanzees and gorillas have a lot of commonalities. I mean, certainly there's a difference in body size, but they have a lot of commonalities in things like their locomotor behavior. And so those commonalities, one sort of way of thinking about this is that those commonalities are ones that were shared by the taxa that gave rise to chimpanzees and gorillas. And so one thought is, well, because these two taxa are so similar, that those similarities existed in the last common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees. So chimpanzees and humans would have evolved from a really chimp-like African ape. Something that probably was engaged in knuckle walking like we see in chimps and gorillas today. And part of the thinking on that is just because knuckle walking is such an unusual form of quadrupedal. Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of quadrupeds among sort of the terrestrial mammals of the world, but there are very few knuckle walkers, and chimpanzees and gorillas are, you know, share that commonality. So the one thought is like, well, they're so similar in terms of their behavior that these are not, and knuckle walking is so unusual that they are similarities that didn't just evolve independently. And so that's kind of been one sort of long-standing view. It's kind of the view from, you know, phylogeny. But another view that's been sort of explored more recently in light of some new fossil discoveries is that, well, maybe chimpanzees and gorillas did evolve their knuckle walking quadrupedalism independently, and that the last common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees wasn't a knuckle walker at all. It was a more kind of generalized quadrupedal African ape that was climbing around in the trees and engaged in some terrestrial quadrupedalism, but maybe not doing it exactly the way chimpanzees or gorillas do. And
so knuckle walking could have been a new sort of a derived thing.
Right. So that's one thought, is that knuckle walking could have evolved independently in chimpanzees and in gorillas, but was not shared by the sort of ancestral lineage that gave rise to those two species. So, you know, those are kind of two interesting ideas, and there's a lot of discussion going on in the field about, you know, what the likelihood of each is. And there are, you know, lots of clever arguments that have been put out there for each sort of different viewpoint. And that's something that kind of the field is sort of working through. But I think what we can say is that we know that the last common ancestor, and we have confidence that the last common ancestor was some kind of quadrupedal, arboreal African ape that engaged in, you know, both living in the trees and probably living on the ground to a certain extent. Some other things that people have tried to look at are not just kind of what's its generalized locomotor behavior, but how big was the last common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees. And there are some, sophisticated statistical methods that can be used to sort of predict what the size of the last common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees would have been, given the size of chimps and the size of humans and our earliest human ancestors. And what kind of the early fossil record seems to indicate, and what some of these statistical analyses seem to suggest, is that the last common ancestor would have been about the size of a chimpanzee. So we probably started off, the last common ancestor of humans probably started off as, a chimp-sized arboreal quadrupedal primate that was living in the trees and living on the ground. And from there is, where we get human walking kind of evolving.
Yeah, it's just finding that that fossil skeleton, or even partial skeleton. That will be an amazing day.
Right. And I mean, and we do have fossils that are right around that time period where we think hominins are originating. And as you might expect, it gets very tricky to figure out if something at that time period is on the human lineage, or if it's on the chimpanzee lineage, or is another variety of kind of early ape.
Well, there are a few contenders for the last common ancestor between humans and chimps. 6 million-year-old Orrerin and 7 million-year-old Sahelanthropus come to mind. Looking at the fossil record from Africa, everything that has led to us, what do you think happened to our ancestors that changed their bodies so much and made our upright stance and gait so unique?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it's a question that a lot of researchers in biological anthropology are very interested in. Wow. And I think you can kind of think about it in two different ways. The first is kind of what was the sort of reason for the origins of bipedalism. And I think if you talk to a lot of different researchers, they'll probably tell you that that is a very difficult question to answer, if it's answerable at all. And so if we can kind of move past sort of the question of, well, what's the reason for the origins of bipedalism? We can start to think about, well, what is the early evolution of bipedalism actually like? Like, if we accept that, the earliest ancestors were engaging in bipedal behavior, what aspects of bipedalism do we really want to change in order to improve sort of bipedal walking? So once the, whatever the selective pressure is that sort of drives these hominins to engage in more bipedal locomotor capabilities, what do you want to do at that point in order to sort of improve your bipedal walking? So that's sort of where kind of I tend to sort of focus my research interests on, kind of what happens that, what aspects of bipedalism do you really want to make better in order to make you a better walker, and then eventually a runner. Now, one thing to keep in mind about all of this, and something that I think you mentioned in the introduction, which is this question of, well, like, where are we starting from? And we think about sort of the origins of bipedalism, but we're not really starting from a 0 point. The bipedal walking is something that we know that quadrupedal primates can and do engage in. Something like a chimpanzee or a macaque or a capuchin monkey or spider monkey. All of these are living primates that use bipedalism or participate in it in some very limited amount as part of their kind of normal locomotor repertoire. So there's no reason to think that, like, the early evolution of bipedalism was kind of just sort of stand up from quadrupedalism. We think that the early hominins and the kind of last common ancestor of humans and chimps would have been capable of at least some limited amount of bipedal walking. The problem is that it's really a very small part of what they do. And so, you have some kind of selective pressure early on that sort of drives up the need or the benefit for engaging in that bipedal behavior. And I think that's sort of the question about the origins of bipedalism. What really caused drove the earliest hominins to walk bipedally more than sort of what we might see in a chimpanzee or something else. So maybe if a chimp walks bipedally 2% of their day, there's some ecological pressure or some benefit to walking around on two legs for maybe 10% of your day or 15% of your day. And presumably that's tied into some change in the ecological environment, something about exploiting a different ecological resource or some benefit that accrues from walking on two legs. Now, once you've committed to sort of walking on two legs, then the question is, well, what do you need to do to get better at it? And that's sort of where, kind of, as I said earlier, that's sort of where my work kind of comes in. And I'm interested in trying to understand, well, what is really different and what is potentially beneficial about two-legged walking in humans as compared to what facultative bipeds, something like a chimpanzee, is capable of doing. So we use this term sort of facultative bipedalism to just mean like bipedalism in very sort of short, limited quantities, like something that we, as I said, we see in a chimpanzee. And so a lot of the work that I've sort of focused on is trying to figure out, what aspects of bipedal walking mechanics are sort of present in chimpanzees, and what are their commonalities with what we see in humans.
Obviously, whatever changed, we kept doing it. I think that's the quite fascinating thing. We didn't fluctuate as far as we know.
One of the things that we need to look at to sort of get a better handle on what early bipedalism might have looked like is we of course need to have some fossil evidence or some fossil data to give us a sense of what skeletal traits are actually changing early on in human evolution. And we really didn't have a lot of good data for that sort of 20 years ago. But since then, we've had a number of important fossils that have been published that give us a little bit of insight into what's going on in that first kind of 4 to 8 million years of hominin evolution. So if we kind of start with the earliest one, there's a little bit of material from Chad, which is kind of in north central Africa. And this material is best known from a skull that was published in the really early 2000s. And an analysis of that skull, and one of the traits that they identified as being indicative of bipedalism was the position of this hole on the bottom of the head called the foramen magnum. And in things that are bipedal, the foramen magnum tends to be positioned a bit more forward on the underside of the skull than things that are quadrupedal. And this makes sense when you think about kind of the position of the neck in the way sort of say humans have it when we walk around on two legs versus sort of the position of the neck being sort of more horizontal in something that walks around on four.
Yeah, the spine would have to be sort of like directly under it. I don't want to say, vertical, but that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's essentially one of the sort of major differences that we can identify between humans and chimpanzees in the skull that might relate to how our bodies were positioned during bipedal walking. And so we see that, and that gives us a little bit of insight, and that's sort of been kind of the earliest evidence is in Sahelanthropus, there's a little bit more of an anterior position, maybe not quite human-like, but a bit more of an anterior position of the foramen magnum in this taxon than what we see in, say, chimps or gorillas. Now, interestingly, a year or so ago, a paper was published on a potentially associated femur. So when the material was originally found and described in the early 2000s, it was really focused on the skull. But there was a subsequent publication that mentioned the possibility of femoral material being found in the same sort of locality as the Sahelanthropus skull. And that femur was just recently described and published. And what they found is when they looked at the femur, and they don't have all of it, they're kind of missing the most...
it was quite disputed, that one, wasn't it?
Proximal end. Yeah, I mean, it was an interesting finding. They really, in the paper, they talk about it as being, unclear if it was a primate, and doing some analyses to sort of identify it as being a primate, and then more detailed analyses that seem to indicate that of all the primates, it looked most similar to a chimpanzee. And so based on that, they kind of raised the possibility that maybe Sahelanthropus was not necessarily a hominid. Maybe it was kind of an early ape. Maybe it was, something on the chimpanzee lineage. There are a lot of possibilities when you're that far back in the fossil record. And, naturally, it's a very difficult thing to try and, identify which lineage this thing fits on when you've sort of, you're near what was likely the speciation event that led to the human and chimpanzee lineage. So that material has been really exciting and interesting to look at. And, as is often the case in research of this type, it sort of raises as many questions as it answers. So we have the Sahelanthropus material. Then a little later on, we see material around 6 million years from Auroran. And the sort of functionally relevant, or what we hope is functionally relevant material there, is going to be sort of the upper half of a femur. And for that material, a couple of different analyses have been done with it, where they've suggested that it may be human-like, or it may have a lot of commonalities with some of the sort of Miocene apes that we see in Europe and other parts of kind of the North Africa region. And these analyses have kind of suggested that it was capable of some mode of bipedalism, but it's, again, not entirely clear how this thing would have walked around by just looking at the proximal femur. And so then we have, if we go a little bit further in time, we have a little bit of a toe bone from Ardipithecus cadava, which is material that's coming out of Ethiopia. And the Cadava toe bone has a couple of features that suggested that the way the foot was used in sort of push off, that is, when we're walking, we sort of have a stance phase and then a phase that we swing our limbs. And towards the end of the stance phase, that period we're supporting our body weight on one or two limbs. We sort of push off with the limb that's sort of positioned behind our body. And that kind of accelerates our body upward and forward, and accelerates our limb into swing. And there's some aspects of this toe bone that have been tied to the ability to sort of push off in a manner that may have been different from the way a facultative biped.
So not too curved and sort of like, branch hugging? Is that what you're implying?
Oh, well, in terms of the shape of the toe?
Toe, yeah.
Yeah, well, in terms of the trait in specific that they've looked at is the sort of on the what's called the proximal end, kind of the the end sort of closest to the ankle, the orientation of that proximal end suggests that there's a little bit more flexion that is capable of that joint that would have facilitated a more kind of advanced sort of push-off mechanism than what we might see in a chimpanzee. So we have all of those data, and as I said, it's kind of a little sparse. There isn't a ton to go on. But then we get to sort of 4.5, 4.4 million years ago, and we have this incredible skeleton from Ardipithecus ramidus, which includes a really detailed look at the pelvis and the lower extremity and the foot. And there we can start to see what evolution is starting to tinker with in order to build us into a better bipedal walker. So there are traits in the foot, there are some traits in the pelvis that seem to relate to changes in our walking capabilities. And presumably, these would have improved the bipedal walking of Ardipithecus ramidus compared to something like a chimpanzee. So that's sort of the fossil record that we have up until until we get to later sort of Australopithecines.
Well, your work is centered around a lab-based experimental approach. Much of what you do is looking at chimpanzees and how they walk and how this can be then related to human locomotion. So can you tell us how the study of chimp biomechanics can shed light on the story of human bipedality?
Sure. I mean, chimpanzee bipedalism has always been kind of an important part of the context for human evolution. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I mean, people are interested in chimpanzees, not just in the context of locomotor behavior, but in all aspects of their behavior. I mean, they're our closest living relatives. And so when we look at humans and we look at chimpanzees, we see a lot of differences. But as we were talking earlier, those differences are all evolved since we diverged, 6 to 8 million years ago. And so our focus on chimpanzee bipedalism is for a number of reasons. I mean, one is that they're our closest living relative, and there are some reasons to believe and some arguments that have been made that the last common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees would have been very chimpanzee-like. Another is that chimpanzees are, as we mentioned earlier, about the size of the last common ancestor of humans and chimps, or where we think that size range is, around the size of the earliest hominins. And so it kind of looking at chimpanzees can be really valuable for that reason. Additionally, as we mentioned earlier, chimpanzees use bipedalism as kind of a normal part of their locomotor behavior. And so their bipedal capabilities can be really instructive in terms of giving us some polarity as to what aspects of human bipedalism are really unique. And so, I've been working on in kind of this area of work for a while, but that work on chimpanzee bipedalism has been going on for a long time. Some of the earliest studies were done in the 1940s by researchers that just sort of were filming chimpanzees and then just sort of describing what some of the differences were that they saw between chimpanzees and humans. And that work has sort of continued in fits and starts since then. But I think our work in that area really began sort of in around 2009, 2010. We decided, my colleagues and I, that we really needed to get a really detailed handle on how facultative bipedalism works, but particularly how it works in a chimpanzee. And when we looked at the literature that was out there already, we could see little bits and pieces, but there wasn't any kind of comprehensive look at how chimpanzee bipedalism worked. And that's what we've kind of been working on. And so one of the first things that we wanted to do when we started work on this is just sort of characterize, well, what are the differences in terms of the way our limbs move as compared to chimpanzees. Because as I said, there have been studies here and there that had looked at it, but nothing sort of comprehensive that sort of captured what was going on in the upper body and the pelvis and hind limbs and in the foot. And so that's work that all of my collaborators and I have been engaged in. And one of the reasons, as I said, that we want to look at that is because if we can see how things work in a chimp, and we can see similarly how things work in humans, and we can really see, well, what aspects of habitual bipedalism that we use are really distinct, because there may be more commonalities or there may be more differences between humans and chimps than we sort of realize from the data that are out there. And if we know what aspects of human bipedalism are unique, then we can start to take that information and go to the fossil record and try to understand how traits of the skeletal system or the muscular system might facilitate some of those differences, and then use the fossil record to get some insight into kind of what is changing about walking when. But as I said, really the place to start with a problem like that is we really need to characterize how bipedalism works in chimpanzees.
Sounds like a deductive process. Would you put it down to that?
Yeah, I would certainly. And I would say, the kind of place that we've started with that work was to try and say, well, just how do chimpanzees walk on two legs? What are their limb movements like? And there have been, even a sort of casual observation of a chimp walking on two legs would tell you that they have a more sort of flexed limb than what we have. But the sort of, I would say, kind of our knowledge of how limbs, how the body moved was sort of, ended there. Like we didn't have a lot of comprehensive data on this. And so one of the things that we've seen is that, chimpanzees, they just have a lot more, pelvis and lower extremity or hind limb motion than what we see in humans. And so one of the things that we kind of determined early on is that, well, one aspect of sort of making human bipedalism better has been simply to control some of that motion, to reduce the amount of pelvis rotation that we use, and sort of make the kind of mechanics of human walking a bit simpler and a bit less a little bit less dynamic, I would say. And so we've looked at things like how the upper body moves, and we've looked at how the foot works in chimpanzee bipedalism. And so like another interesting thing that we found is, when you look at the foot of a chimpanzee, you can see that you have this big grasping hallux. It seems to be a fairly mobile structure, something that they can kind of wrap around a tree trunk to facilitate climbing and everything else. And so it was sort of generally assumed that a lot of the way the foot would work during bipedalism would involve a lot of mobility. But we actually found, some colleagues and I found that when chimpanzees walk on two legs, they actually have a fairly limited amount of motion of the foot during bipedalism, actually less than what we use. And so kind of as part of that, we're getting a better sense of how the musculoskeletal system is actually working in chimp bipedalism. So we've continued that work to now we're sort of working more on the mechanics of bipedalism in chimps, and actually trying to quantify what the differences are for something like push-off, like we talked about earlier. Yes. And so in those sorts of studies, we're starting to get better insight into how not just the skeletal system moves, but how it interacts with the muscle tendon system as well. And one of the things that we found is one of the sort of advantages of human-like walking is we do it in such a way that we have this really large push-off impulse So as we get to sort of as I said earlier, as we get to kind of the end of a step, we generate a bunch of power, principally at our ankle, but also at our hip, to sort of accelerate our bodies upward and forward. And in human walking, not only do we have this large push off, but a lot of it's coming from kind of these elastic mechanisms in the body. So in particular, things like the Achilles tendon. And so something like the Achilles tendon, which is this long tendon on the back of our, sits kind of behind our ankle.
Oh, yes.
This long Achilles tendon is something that humans have, but something like a chimpanzee does not. And so we can see that one of the benefits of having an Achilles tendon is to enhance the sort of push-off mechanism.
It gives us the bounce in our step, doesn't it?
Right, exactly. It gives us the bounce in our step. So that's something that, we've sort of, identified as a trait where the evolution of it may be tied to a range of locomotor behaviors, but we can see some benefits for walking in particular. And so, we can go to the fossil record and try and figure out, well, when might, an Achilles tendon first sort of appeared in hominid evolution. And so there are researchers that are working on questions like that. I mean, obviously it's very tricky because we can't, we only have skeletal material to work with. And so researchers are trying to correlate changes in the muscle tendon system to changes in underlying bone size and shape, the, position of attachments, the amount of trabecular bone that we see in places where these muscle tendon systems are attached. So, we're sort of working through the process of trying to figure out, well, what are the real distinctive aspects of human bipedalism, and trying to use that information to look back at the fossil record and figure out, well, when did these shifts actually occur? So one of the things that's important about kind of looking at bipedalism in chimpanzees is to get a sense of to what extent it not only is similar and different to humans, but is it similar, and in what ways is it different from other facultative bipeds? And so we've done a little bit of work on that, and what we're somewhat sort of surprised to find is that when we compared bipedal walking limb motion in chimps compared to similar data collected from macaques, the sort of mode of facultative bipedalism was nearly the same. There are some interesting differences that we saw at the ankle between bipedal macaques and bipedal chimpanzees that are probably tied into differences in their feet. In particular, bipedal macaques walk with a sort of digitigrade foot posture, so they kind of walk on their toes a bit, whereas chimpanzees and other African apes are more planigrade. They kind of walk with their feet sort of fully flat on the ground. And that's really what we see in the Ardipithecus foot, and likely in earlier hominins, is a more African ape-like foot. Now, researchers have pointed out some differences between the foot of, say, Ardipithecus and an African ape, but I think everyone would probably agree that that foot looks much more like a chimpanzee's foot than it looks like, say, a macaque's foot. And so even though chimpanzees have this sort of unusual form of quadrupedalism, it's not clear that that really bleeds over into their bipedalism in any sort of meaningful way.
Matt, you wrote a paper not long ago on the apparent super strength of chimpanzees and how that relates to human beings. So why is chimp strength important for the study of human upright walking and human evolution?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I think it's something that we hadn't really, I think, hadn't really been discussed that much in the fossil side of the literature. But my interests are, broadly musculoskeletal function, and there's this sort of longstanding idea that chimpanzees are really different in terms of their strength capabilities than humans. But like I said, if we think about this in the context of human evolution, that difference between humans and chimpanzees in terms of their underlying muscle strength would be something that would have had to evolve in the chimpanzee lineage separate from humans, or something that was shared with humans early in our evolutionary history, and maybe something that we lost sort of along the way. And so, if there is a big difference in skeletal muscle tissue properties, then that may change what we think sort of the locomotor capabilities and energy costs and other aspects of bipedalism might have looked like in some of these earliest hominins. So in the 1920s, there was a study that was published where a researcher who doesn't appear to have any academic affiliation, as far as I can tell, writes a paper, and he basically says, look, everybody seems to think that chimpanzees are really strong, but nobody's directly measured it. So I'm going to go and measure this, and I'm going to report my findings. And so what he does is he goes to a nearby university. The paper is written, the affiliation is just Allentown, Pennsylvania. And he goes to a nearby university, Muhlenberg College, and borrows a piece of equipment called a dynamometer, which is basically a kind of a scale on a tethered spring, and you sort of pull on this and it tells you how much force you're pulling with. And he takes this thing to a New York zoo, and he gets a couple of chimpanzees to pull on this thing, and he's sort of able to induce these chimps at the zoo to pull on it as hard as they can. And when he does this, he reports these values of pulling force, or he reports it in pounds. But what he finds is that these the maximum pulling strength of these chimps is like 1,200 pounds, which is, about 550 kilograms. So it's that's the sort of maximum measurement he gets. He measures it, takes a few more measurements that aren't quite as high. But the animal that's doing this is like 68 kilograms or so. And so it ends up being about 8 times their body weight that this animal pulls this contraption on. And that number is insanely high. And even by today's standards, if you look at like professional weightlifters, like there's a lift called the deadlift, which is basically just grab weight and pull it up. And even that, I think the current world record for the deadlift is slightly below what was the maximum value reported in this paper in 1926. And so that's sort of the origin of this idea of chimpanzees, or at least some sort of data-based evidence that chimpanzees are really super strong. And so this work gets sort of picked up at different intervals over the sort of intervening 75 years. And so around World War II, there's a researcher at a university that does some experiments with chimps. There's another series of experiments that are done in kind of the mid-60s during the space race. And then after that, kind of in the early 2000s, there were a couple of studies that were done. And what's interesting is sort of subsequent to that initial 1926 study, the data sort of become much more reasonable in that those subsequent studies basically report is that, chimpanzees have high pulling strength, but it's only relative to their body size. So these absolute values that were reported in 1926 just can't be duplicated. So like any sort of experiment that can't be duplicated, you sort of start to wonder if there's maybe something wrong with the work that was done early on, because what the subsequent work seems to converge on is a value of not like 8 times body weight, but maybe something much closer to about 1.5 times body weight. is the sort of strength. So there does appear to be a strength differential between humans and chimpanzees, but it's not nearly what we see in what was reported early on. And so some different ideas about why this exists, some different hypotheses that have been put forward had to do with sort of the intrinsic skeletal muscle tissue itself. Mm-hmm. Like something about chimpanzee skeletal muscle is really different from human skeletal muscle. And so we had the good fortune to be able to measure some properties of kind of individual muscle fibers from chimps and from humans. Mm-hmm. And what we found is that the intrinsic properties of chimpanzee muscle are really the same. There isn't a big difference in terms of how much force square centimeter of muscle can generate compared to the amount of force that a square centimeter of human muscle can generate. There isn't a big difference in terms of the rate at which that muscle can shorten. And these are really the underlying properties that affect the dynamic functioning of skeletal muscle. Where we did see a big difference, though, is we looked at the fiber type distribution in skeletal muscle of humans and chimps. And what we found is that the fiber type distribution, that is the sort of number of slow fibers and the number of fast fibers that we see in human and chimp skeletal muscle, were really different. And that chimpanzees had a very sort of balanced distribution of slow and fast fibers, whereas humans have a really high percentage of slow twitch fibers in our skeletal muscle. And we really stand out, not just against chimpanzees. If you look at chimps, they look like a lot of other terrestrial mammals in terms of their fiber type distribution. It's humans that look like they're a little bit different. And so when we were trying to relate that fiber type difference back to the strength question, the only way we could really do it effectively was to use a mathematical model of how muscles work. And there are some long-standing models that describe the dynamic behavior of muscle when it gets activated and has to generate force. And so we did some computer simulations to try and look at how that a chimpanzee-like muscle and a human-like muscle would behave under sort of maximum pulling and kind of maximum shortening, lengthening behaviors. And what we found was that the fiber type difference that we had observed was really could account for most of that strength differential that was being measured in these earlier experimental studies. And so it kind of raises the question of like, well, maybe there is this big sort of fiber type shift that if chimpanzees look like other terrestrial mammals, if they look like other apes and other primates, then humans appear to be the outlier. And why would human fiber type distributions have shifted over the course of hominin evolution? And so there are some real benefits to having a relatively large volume of slow twitch fibers for things like reducing the energy that you use when you activate that muscle, or the sort of fatigue resistance of that muscle. So a slow twitch fiber, you can turn on and off a lot more frequently in series than you can a fast twitch fiber. And so a fast twitch fiber will just sort of fatigue faster and generates, so you get lactic acid buildup in the muscle. And so we think that this benefit of sort of changing this fiber type distribution is probably tied to the need to be able to travel longer distances. And that could be walking, it could be running, but the need to perpetually turn your muscles on and off over longer durations would really benefit from having this uptick in slow twitch fiber content, even if it drives down some of your muscle strength or your dynamic muscle strength overall.
And could have this been a mutation, an adaptation, or how do you see it?
Yeah, so exactly. I think there's the potential for some real selective value, as we said, and so how it happened is really an interesting question. Obviously, with something like this, you're not going to have any fossil material to use to kind of directly address the question, and so I think the question of kind of when this shift in fiber type distribution took place, I think we can speculate based on some perceived benefits of that change. But we really need to have a better understanding of the genetic basis of how you get fiber type changes. And I don't think it's going to be just a single mutation. It's probably going to be changes in the regulatory mechanisms that change sort of fiber type globally across many muscles and not just in one. So there are researchers that are working on that particular question. And I think as we get better insight into the underlying genetics, we might be able to use that information to get a better handle on what genetic shifts might have occurred when in order to change fiber type distribution in the course of hominin evolution.
Well, as human beings, we are probably always going to be captivated by our past and why we started doing what we ended up doing. Your work has certainly shown a light on this fascinating subject of human bipedality, and I'm definitely looking forward to seeing what else you and your team uncover in the future. So, what's your next project? A new paper, maybe, or perhaps a book in the works?
So a lot of the work that we're doing now is, yes, we're working on writing papers, and a lot of it is sort of focused on, we've done these kind of lab-based, as you said, sort of analyses of how chimpanzee bipedalism works. But what we're really working towards is sort of integrating that lab-based data with computer models of the musculoskeletal system.
Oh, yes.
One of the things that we have sort of, had our sights set on early on when we started this work on chimpanzee bipedalism was really getting an integrative look at how the system worked. And one of the really great ways to try and do that is to use computer modeling and simulation of the musculoskeletal system. And these are techniques that have been developed outside of any evolutionary context, or techniques that are used to study human health, for prosthetic design, and other aspects of understanding how the human musculoskeletal system works. But we're really trying to take those tools and use them to answer interesting evolutionary questions. And so we have a lot of work going on in terms of generating simulations of chimpanzee bipedal walking and trying to ultimately relate changes in the little details that we get in the fossil record back to actual dynamic behavior of bipedal walking. And we think that that work's going to be really important for the early part of hominin evolution, where we're really trying to figure out what traits can tell us exactly about changes in the fossil record. And so that is really sort of where a lot of our lab work currently is focused.
I will leave links to your social media and research papers in the description below. And all that's left to say is thank you very much indeed, Matthew, for coming on to Evolution Soup.
Mark, it was my pleasure. I really appreciate you inviting me on. So thanks again.